The dust of the high plains tasted like an ending. For Asher von Vaughn, it always did. The end of a season, the end of a long day, the end of his patience. He stood on the porch of the ranch house his grandfather had built with blood and timber, and watched the stagecoach crawl out of the bleeding sunset. It was a lumbering beast, caked in the red earth of the territory, and it carried a promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. A mail-order bride. A solution to the silence that had filled this house for too long. But when the coach door groaned open, it wasn't a solution that stepped out. It was a question. She was framed in the golden light, a silhouette that made the air go still. Her dress was light blue, somehow clean despite the 100 miles of grit and grime. Her name was Seraphine Duval, or so the letter had said. She stepped down, not like a woman weary from a long journey, but like a queen inspecting new territory. Her boots landed on the packed earth with a soft, final thud. Her face, kissed by the dying sun, held a calm that was all wrong. It was the calm of a hunter, not the hunted. The composure of a woman who carried secrets far heavier than her travel satchel. Asher felt it in his bones, a cold dread that coiled in his gut. He was a man who measured his world in acres and livestock, in threats you could see and touch. But this woman, she was an invisible current, a storm gathering just over the horizon. He wasn't just looking at her beauty, which was stark and sharp as a shard of glass. He was weighing the danger she brought with her, a scent on the wind he couldn't name but knew would lead to ruin. His knuckles went white on the railing. Something in her lit both a fire and a warning inside him, and that's when he noticed it. As she took in the house, the towering cottonwoods, the distant corrals, her gaze wasn't one of simple observation. It was a gaze of recognition. The days that followed were a silent war, fought with glances and held breaths. Seraphine moved through the grand, quiet halls of the Vaughn Manor, not like a stranger, but like someone returning home. Her footsteps were soft, but they echoed with a disturbing familiarity. She'd traced the sweeping curve of the main staircase banister with a hand that seemed to remember its feel, her fingers lingering as if recalling a forgotten dream. She would pause before the dusty portraits of long-dead Vaughns, her eyes scanning the austere faces for just a beat too long, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. The library, a room Asher hadn't set foot in for years, became her sanctuary. He'd see the lamplight glowing from its windows late into the night. He once walked past the open door and saw her running a delicate finger along the spines of his father's old ledgers, a ghost of a smile on her lips. It wasn't the smile of a woman reading for pleasure. It was the smile of a woman finding clues. Asher's life, once dictated by the predictable rhythms of sun and soil, was now completely fractured. His foreman, old Silas, a man with a face like a dried riverbed, saw it clear as day. "Something on your mind, boss," Silas grunted one afternoon by the calving pens, his eyes sharp. Asher just shook his head, his gaze sweeping across the fields, but it always, inevitably, drifted back toward the house. Back toward her. He'd catch glimpses of her everywhere. A flash of her blue dress on the veranda as she watched the distant mountains. The line of her chin tilted just so as she watched him work with the horses. Each time their eyes met, it was like flint striking steel. A spark that ignited in the vast space between them, a silent challenge that was both a dare and a promise. She'd meet his stare without flinching, a knowing glint in her eyes that drove him half mad. It was a look that said, "You have no idea who I am." Whispers began to snake through the ranch hands and the house staff. Mrs. Gable, the cook whose opinions were as unmovable as her iron stove, muttered to the scullery maid, "Her hands, child, they're soft, but the way she holds a cup, it's firm, like a man's, and the way she looks at you, like she's measuring your soul for a coffin." The hands spoke of her intelligence, the sharp, quick way she'd answer a question, her unnerving ability to size up a man or a horse with a single glance. She was no blushing bride-to-be. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had walked through fire and hadn't been burned. Asher heard the murmurs, he saw the speculative glances, and a deep, cold certainty began to grow in his gut. This woman was a lie. He tried to fight the pull, to lose himself in the familiar scent of leather and horseflesh, the hard, honest work of his ranch. But it was no use. His eyes were drawn back to her again and again. It wasn't just desire, though, that was a fever in his blood. It was a premonition, a bone-deep feeling that their paths hadn't just crossed by chance. They were tangled by a fate spun long before they were born, bound by the heavy, invisible chains of an ancient, unpaid debt. The silence of the ranch, once his comfort, now felt charged, electric, ready to shatter. He was standing on a cliff edge, and she was the wind at his back, pushing him closer to the fall. He knew he had to confront it. He had to know the truth. But he also knew with a terrifying certainty that the truth would destroy him. The tension finally broke on a Thursday. The air in the grand dining room was thick enough to choke on. The silence stretched so taut it hummed. Lamplight pooled on the polished mahogany table, illuminating a dinner that had barely been touched. Asher's fork was frozen in his hand, his eyes locked on Seraphine. The game of glances, the silent war, had reached its breaking point. Tonight, there would be a surrender. She rose from her chair, her movements as fluid and silent as smoke. Her blue dress seemed a deeper, more dangerous shade in the dim light. She approached him, her footsteps lighter than falling leaves, and the scent of her, lavender and something wild, like a storm-washed prairie, wrapped around him, tightening his chest. He held his breath as she stopped beside his chair. Her shadow fell across his plate. Then her fingers, cool and slender, brushed against the rough fabric of his sleeve. The touch was impossibly light, but it seared him like a brand. Every nerve in his body screamed to attention. He felt a tremor in her hand, or maybe it was his own. Her voice, a husky murmur meant only for him, ghosted against his ear. "You wouldn't believe what's under this dress, Asher." The words hit him like a physical blow, a jolt of raw, carnal desire, so sharp it was almost pain, shot through him. He let out a short, rough laugh that sounded foreign in the quiet room, a desperate attempt to break the spell she was weaving. He turned, his eyes searching hers, trying to read the challenge, the promise, the threat. Her gaze was a deep, bottomless well. He could fall in and never find his way out. He stood so fast his chair scraped back, the sound a violation of the room's decorum. Without a single word he took her hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, a silent pact forged in the flickering lamplight. He led her from the dining room, up the grand, silent staircase, into the shadows. Each step on the old wood echoed like a drumbeat, counting down to a revelation he both craved and feared. The air grew thick with the scent of old timber, dust, and her intoxicating, dangerous perfume. The door to his bedroom clicked shut behind them, sealing them in a world of their own, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the window and the single bedside lamp he lit. The flames threw their shadows, long and dancing, against the walls. She stood with her back to him and began to unlace her dress. Her movements weren't seductive, they were deliberate, almost ritualistic. The heavy blue fabric peeled away, revealing the pale skin of her back. Layer by layer, silk and cotton fell to the floor in a soft, sighing heap. Asher watched, mesmerized, his heart a wild thing trapped in his ribs. He expected to see soft curves, the perfection of a body he had only dared to imagine. But what he saw when she turned to face him was not perfection. It was history. A brutal, violent history carved into her flesh. Stretching across her left side from just below her rib cage down to her hip was a scar. It wasn't the clean line of an accident or a surgeon's knife. This was a jagged, angry river of silvered tissue, a mark left by methodical cruelty. It was a signature of pain, deliberate and vicious. The air left Asher's lungs in a silent, ragged gasp. The heat of desire vanished, replaced by a wave of ice-cold shock. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the landscape of her past. Seraphine's voice, when she finally spoke, was stripped of all its earlier provocation. It was low, steady, and brittle as glass. This, she said, her own fingers tracing the raised angry tissue, was a gift from Clive Roar. The name hit Asher like a phantom bullet. Clive Roar, a name whispered in hushed tones around the territory years ago. A rival rancher, a man known for his bottomless cruelty, a man whose life had supposedly ended in a bloody, drunken brawl in some dusty saloon. A ghost, a story told to frighten greenhorns. He swore I'd never forget him, Asher, she continued, her eyes holding his. In their depths he saw not just pain, but a cold, burning fire. And he made sure of it. The shock that held Asher frozen began to melt, replaced by something dark and violent. The horror of what had been done to her collided with a fierce, possessive surge of rage. This wasn't just a mail-order bride. This was a survivor. A warrior who wore the map of her battles on her own skin. His desire returned, twisted now with a need to protect, to avenge, to claim what another man had so brutally marked. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and his fingers traced the grotesque beauty of the scar. It was warm to the touch. It was real. The night that followed was a fever, a desperate, raw collision of two solitudes. It wasn't gentle passion. It was a violent confrontation, a search for both pleasure and oblivion. Their bodies met, sweat-slicked and tangled. His kisses were hungry, trying to erase the ghost of another man's brutality. Her response was just as fierce, her nails digging into his back, her movements both yielding and demanding, as if she was trying to claw the memories out of her own flesh. It was a symphony of pleasure and pain played out in the dim, shadowed light. And then, at the very peak of their surrender, a shudder ripped through her entire body. A sound tore from her throat, a deep, guttural sob that seemed to come from the very center of her soul. Tears, hot and visceral, streamed from her eyes, wetting his shoulder. It wasn't the sound of physical pain. It was the crushing weight of a memory so terrible it could not be contained, a past that refused to be forgotten, even in a moment of desperate intimacy. Asher held her tighter, her tremors shaking them both. He tasted the salt of her tears, and in that moment, as he cradled her brokenness against his chest, he finally understood. This beautiful, enigmatic woman hadn't come to his ranch seeking a new life. She had come seeking a fortress, because the war she was fighting wasn't over. And Clive Roar, the ghost from his own past, had just returned to demand a final reckoning. The revelation of Seraphine's scar and the name attached to it changed everything. The silent war of glances was over, replaced by a desperate, consuming alliance. Their nights became a feverish tangle of passion and whispered confessions, a shared battle against the ghost of Clive Roar. Each touch was now laced with an urgency, as if they both knew their time was running out. Asher found himself fiercely protective, his instincts warring with the cold, hard logic of a rancher. He was falling for a woman who was a magnet for trouble, but the truth couldn't be contained within the four walls of his bedroom. The ranch itself began to feel the ripple effects of her perilous past. It started subtly, like a change in the wind before a hurricane. Seasoned ranch hands, men who knew every rock and ravine on the Vaughn lands, started reporting strange signs. Unfamiliar tracks near the southern fence line, not the mark of a lone rider or a stray drifter. These were organized, deliberate. Then came the sightings. 2, sometimes 3, horsemen lingering on the ridgeline at dusk. They weren't passing through. They were watching, waiting. "Seen some fellas on the outskirts, Asher," old Silas told him one morning, his voice low and gravelly over coffee. "Don't recognize their mounts, and they ain't looking for work." A cold knot tightened in Asher's gut. He rode the perimeter himself, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight on his shoulders, a chilling confirmation that Clive Roar was no ghost. His dark legacy was manifesting in flesh and blood. These were his men. You could see it in their hard faces, glimpsed from a distance. You could feel it in the menace that hummed in the air around them. The threat began to escalate. The whispers from the watchers on the ridge became venomous rumors in the nearby town of Blackwood Creek. The supply wagon driver brought the news first. "That new bride of Vaughn's," old man Hemlock had grumbled at the saloon, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "They say she comes from New Orleans, carries the inheritance of an ancient crime." The stories churned and twisted, painting Seraphine as a harbinger of doom. "Roar's enemies are coming to collect," the saloon keeper warned Silas, "and they won't care whose blood they spill to get it." The poison of these rumors seeped back to the ranch, casting a long, dark shadow. Seraphine retreated into herself. The playful provocations were gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. Asher saw the way her hand would unconsciously stray to her side, where the scar lay hidden beneath her dress. She moved through the house with a new weariness, her gaze constantly drawn to the windows, scanning the horizon. She knew what was coming. Asher was trapped. His heart, dormant for so long, had been violently reawakened by this woman. He wanted to shield her, to build a wall around her with his own body. But the pragmatic rancher, the man responsible for his land and his men, screamed a warning. This beautiful, scarred woman was going to get them all killed. The inheritance of an ancient crime threatened to shatter everything his family had built. Was their connection real, or was she just using him? Using his ranch as a hiding place, his bed as a shield. The doubt was a cancer, eating at him in the quiet hours of the night. He'd remember the raw pain in her eyes, the desperate way she clung to him, and he'd believe in her. But then he'd see the watchers on the ridge, and the cold logic would return. A woman tied to a man like Clive Roar was poison. He armed his most trusted hands. He started sleeping with a Winchester by his bed. The peace of the Vaughn ranch was gone, replaced by the humming tension of a siege. The threats were no longer distant rumors. They were a tightening noose, and then the noose cinched tight. It happened in the dead of night. A handful of his prize cattle were found slaughtered near the eastern boundary, their bodies left as a gruesome message. A few days later, the fence lines around the horse pastures were cut. Not just cut, but ripped down with a deliberate, malicious violence designed to sow chaos. An undeniable sense of impending violence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The attack came in the hushed, pre-dawn hours when the world holds its breath. A single sharp crack of a rifle shattered the silence, then another, then a chorus of shouts and gunshots erupted from the northern corrals. Asher was out of bed in an instant, the Winchester already in his hand. The acrid smell of gunpowder cut through the cool morning air. Seraphine was right behind him, her eyes wide but not with panic. A grim, predatory understanding had settled on her face. "They're trying to scatter the horses," she whispered, her voice shockingly steady. "To draw your men away from the house." Her words were sharp, tactical, cutting through Asher's initial surge of adrenaline. She saw the strategy in the chaos. He sprinted to the window. In the dim light, he saw shadows moving among the corrals, figures on horseback driving the stampeding animals, while others exchanged fire with his men. "Silas, flank them from the east," Asher bellowed, his voice a roar. All his doubts about Seraphine, all his fears, evaporated in the heat of the assault. All that remained was a singular, white-hot resolve. Defend his home. Defend his men. Defend her. He laid down suppressive fire from the porch, his rifle spitting lead into the darkness. And Seraphine, far from cowering, became his partner. She moved with a surprising speed, reloading his spare rifle with an efficiency that stunned him. Her hands were sure, her movements economical. She anticipated his needs before he even knew them. Then a burly attacker with a scarred face tried to flank their position, using the water trough for cover. Before Asher could even turn, Seraphine acted. She produced a small, ornate revolver from the folds of her nightgown, a weapon Asher had never seen before. She fired once. The shot was precise. The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder, a look of pure shock on his face, before he collapsed into the dust. The skirmish was short and brutal. A warning shot. The attackers, having lost one of their own, and facing a much stiffer resistance than they expected, retreated as quickly as they came, melting back into the gloom. The ranch was left scarred, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and smoke. They dragged the wounded attacker into the parlor. The man, gritting his teeth against the pain, glared at Asher with cold, merciless eyes. "Who sent you?" Asher demanded, pressing the barrel of his Winchester against the man's chest. The man sneered, a bloody grin splitting his face. "Raw," he rasped, the name a venomous hiss. "Clive Raw. He ain't dead, Vaughn, not by a long shot, and he's comin' for what's his." Asher's world tilted. The story Seraphine had told him, the drunken brawl, the dusty saloon, was a lie. The ghost was real. Seraphine, who had been standing silently beside him, her face pale but resolute, finally spoke. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "He swore he'd never forget. He's just found a new way to remind me." The revelation hit Asher like a physical blow. The lie was a chasm that opened up between them. The scar on her body wasn't just a memory of past violence. It was a brand from a living, breathing monster who was now at his gates. The captured man, delirious with pain, gave them the rest. "He's gathering a full outfit," the man choked out, spitting blood. "He's comin' for the whole damn ranch, and for her. Says she owes him a fortune and a reckoning." The scale of the threat was no longer a question. It was an impending war. Asher looked at Seraphine, his mind reeling from her deception. Who was this woman? What other lies had she told? The trust he thought they had built was shattered. He felt a surge of cold fury. He had risked everything for her, and she had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies. He waited until Silas had dragged the man away to the tool shed. He turned to face her in the lamp-lit parlor, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to them both. His voice was low, dangerous. "You lied to me." Seraphine didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a storm of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher. "I told you what you needed to hear, Asher. I told you a part of the truth." "A part of the truth?" he shot back, his voice rising. "You let me believe he was dead. You let me fight a ghost while a real army was gathering on my borders." "If I had told you he was alive, would you have let me stay?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting. "Or would you have sent me away to save your precious ranch?" The question struck him silent because he didn't know the answer. He stared at her, this stranger who had shared his bed, fought by his side, and lied to his face. The woman he was falling in love with was a phantom, her true self hidden behind a wall of secrets. "What is it he wants, Seraphine?" he demanded. "What is this fortune you supposedly owe him?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping for the first time. She looked at the floor, then back at him, and he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a raw, stubborn pride. "It's not a fortune," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a birthright, and it's not mine he's after." She took a deep breath, and the next words she spoke demolished what was left of his world. "It's yours." Asher stared at her, the words hanging in the air between them like smoke. "It's yours." The sentence made no sense. His mind scrambled to connect the pieces. Clive Roar, a dead man who was alive. A fortune she supposedly owed him. That was actually his. It was a riddle wrapped in a lie. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. Seraphine's eyes, once so guarded, now held a raw, desperate vulnerability. "My name," she said softly, "is not Duval. That was my mother's name. My father's name was Jacob Vaughn." The name landed like a stone in a silent pool. Jacob Vaughn, Asher's uncle, his father's younger brother. A man spoken of only in whispers, a ghost in the family history. A man who had quarreled violently with Asher's father decades ago and had been cast out, disowned, his name struck from the family Bible. He had vanished, presumed dead in the wilds of the West. "You're my cousin," Asher breathed, the realization a dizzying blow. "Yes," she confirmed, "and our fathers didn't just quarrel over land, Asher. They quarreled over a secret. A secret Clive Roar's family has been trying to reclaim for generations." She walked over to the library, the room she was so drawn to, and pulled a heavy leather-bound book from the shelf. It was his grandfather's journal. She opened it to a marked page. Tucked inside was an old, yellowed piece of parchment, brittle with age. It was a map. "The Vaughn Ranch isn't just cattle and grass, Asher," she explained, her voice gaining strength. "Generations ago, our family, along with the Roars, discovered a lost Spanish silver mine in the Black Hills. They drew two halves of a map. The Vaughns kept one, the Roars the other. But my grandfather, your grandfather, betrayed them. He stole the Roars' half of the map and drove them from this territory." Asher's mind reeled. The local legends, the old tales of a lost mine were true, and his family's legacy was built on theft and betrayal. "My father and yours fought over it," Seraphine continued. "My father wanted to make things right, to return the map. Your father refused. He exiled my father to protect his secret. My father spent his life searching for a way to get justice. He died in New Orleans trying to get close to Clive Roar, who had inherited his family's obsession. That's where I met Roar. I tried to finish what my father started. I tried to get the map piece Roar still had, and he gave me this scar as a reminder of my failure." She looked at him, her entire story laid bare in her eyes. "I lied about his death because I had to. I knew Roar would come here eventually. He believes the other half of the map, our half, is still hidden somewhere on this ranch. I came here as a mail-order bride because it was the only way to get inside, the only way to find the map before he did. I had to know if you were like your father, Asher. I had to know if you would choose greed over honor." The pieces slammed into place. Her strange familiarity with the house, her fascination with the library, her uncanny ability to read a situation. She wasn't running from a fight. She was running toward one. She had used him, yes, but not for protection. She had used him to get to the front line of her own war. His anger, which had been a raging fire, cooled into something else. Awe. This woman, his own blood, had walked into the lion's den with nothing but a false name and a desperate plan. She had faced down the monster from her past to reclaim her family's honor. "So, the first raid. The cattle," he started. "He was testing the defenses," she finished for him. "And looking. Always looking. He won't stop until he burns this entire place to the ground or finds what he's looking for." Asher looked from her determined face to the ancient map in his hand. The weight of his family's sins, of his father's betrayal, settled on his shoulders. This was no longer just Seraphine's fight. It was his, a chance to right a wrong that had festered for generations. Where is it? He asked quietly. Our half of the map. A slow, tired smile touched Seraphine's lips. I found it 3 days ago, she said, tucked inside your mother's recipe book. The last place your father would have ever looked. She pulled a second, identical piece of parchment from the bodice of her dress and laid it next to the first. Together they formed a complete map, pointing to a location deep within the unforgiving peaks of the Black Hills. A new, fragile alliance was forged between them in that moment, born not of passion but of a shared, dangerous truth. The internal war within Asher was over. The enemy was no longer a question of Seraphine's intent. The enemy was real. He was coming, and he wanted to claim a treasure built on a foundation of blood and lies. We'll be ready for him, Asher said, his voice ringing with the resolve he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Seraphine, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a bride, not as a victim, but as Seraphine Vaughn, a woman of fire and iron, his partner, his kin. The ranch immediately transformed. The low-level alert became a frantic preparation for all-out war. Asher, with Seraphine's surprisingly sharp strategic input, began to fortify their home. Barricades of overturned wagons and stacked feed sacks were erected around the main house and barns. Windows were boarded, leaving only small slits for firing. Every barrel was filled with water. Every box of ammunition was brought up from the cellar and distributed. Silas and the other ranch hands, their loyalty to the Vaughn name unshakable, worked without complaint. The whispers and rumors about Seraphine were forgotten, replaced by a grim, unified determination. They saw the change in Asher, the new fire in his eyes, and they saw Seraphine, no longer the mysterious woman from the city, but a commander moving among them, her eyes sharp, suggesting where to reinforce a wall, where to position a lookout. She handled a rifle with a familiarity that spoke of a hard-learned past. The fragile peace between Asher and Seraphine solidified into a bond of mutual respect. They moved in sync, a partnership forged in the crucible of impending violence. The nights were no longer about desperate passion, but about quiet strategy sessions by lamplight, poring over drawings of the ranch, planning for every possible angle of attack. He learned about her life in hiding, the years spent on the run after her father's death. She learned about the lonely weight of his legacy, the ranch he loved but felt trapped by. The lies had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, unvarnished truth. And in that truth, something real began to grow. They knew Roar would not wait long. The captured henchman had revealed the scale of his ambition. This wouldn't be another small raid. This would be an annihilation. The final act began with the rain. A cold, relentless deluge that started just after midnight, turning the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard into a treacherous sea of mud. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to herald the coming of death. The air, thick and heavy, tasted of rain and gunpowder. Inside the fortified ranch house, Asher stood by a barricaded window, his Winchester gripped tight in his hands. Beside him, Seraphine checked the cylinder of her revolver, her face a pale, determined mask in the gloom. The handful of loyal ranch hands were spread out, silent and coiled, their knuckles white on their weapons. They waited. The first sounds were almost lost in the storm. The guttural shouts of men, the frantic snorting of horses, and then the unmistakable crack and splinter of the outer fences giving way. They were here. A shadowy tide of vengeance surged through the broken gates. Clive Roar's men, a force of nearly 24 riders, descended on the ranch. The world exploded into a maelstrom of chaos. Gunshots tore through the torrential rain, each crack muffled by the downpour, but no less deadly. Asher roared orders, his voice raw against the storm, directing his men, his movements practiced and efficient. The fight was a brutal, desperate melee of mud, iron, and blood. Roar's men were relentless, pushing forward, trying to overwhelm the house's defenses. For every one that fell, another seemed to take his place. Asher fought like a cornered bear, a fierce, primal need to protect his home, his legacy, and the woman at his side driving him. Then, amidst the swirling chaos, the main door of the house creaked open. A figure emerged, moving through the rain and smoke like a phantom. It was Seraphine. She was no longer dressed for a siege. She was wearing the same light blue dress she had worn the day she arrived. The delicate fabric was soaked, clinging to her like a second skin, but she moved with an ethereal, unwavering purpose. Her drenched hair framed a face etched with glacial fury. She held her small revolver steady and walked directly into the muddy courtyard towards the main body of Roar's invading force. Her eyes were fixed on one man, Clive Roar himself, mounted on a massive black horse, his face contorted in a mask of cruel triumph as he barked orders. The air seemed to crackle as Seraphine stopped in the middle of the yard. Her voice, clear and sharp as breaking glass, cut through the din of the battle. "You speak of vengeance, Roar," she cried, her words lashing through the rain. Her gaze swept over his men, then landed back on him. "You demand payment for a crime, but I am the one who is owed." Roar laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You owe me a map, little girl, and your life for trying to steal it." "You marked me," she shouted back, her hand instinctively going to her side. "You took my father's life. I didn't come here seeking protection, Roar. I didn't come here to hide." The revelation hung in the air, a shocking truth that momentarily stunned the battlefield into silence. Asher, locked in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle with one of Roar's men, froze. The sheer audacity of her plan slammed into him. This was never about defense. It was always about attack. She had turned the Vaughn ranch into her own personal trap. A hot, righteous fury surged through Asher. It was for his land, yes, but it was also for her. For the years she had spent in fear, for the suffering etched into her skin. With a primal yell, he renewed his attack, his movements infused with a new, savage energy. He fought his way towards her, a singular purpose burning in his mind: protect her, so she could get the justice she had come for. He fought to her side, and they stood back to back, a synchronized force of destruction. Asher with his powerful rifle, Seraphine with her small, deadly revolver, picking off Roar's men with a terrifying precision. She was not a damsel. She was a force of nature, a weapon honed by years of pain. The battle raged, a terrifying dance of death under the storm-lashed sky. But the tide had turned. Roar, caught off guard by Seraphine's direct challenge and the ferocity of the ranch's defense, saw his forces dwindling. His men, who had come for what they thought was an easy score, were now facing two cornered wolves, fighting for more than just land. Roar, in a fit of rage, spurred his horse directly at Seraphine. "The map!" he roared, his eyes wild. "Give me the map!" "It's right here, Clive," she screamed, pulling the two joined pieces of parchment from her dress. She held it up for him to see. It was the bait. It had always been the bait. As Roar lunged for it, distracted for a single, fatal second, Asher raised his Winchester. The shot cracked through the storm, clean and true. Roar's eyes widened in surprise, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He tumbled from his horse, landing with a heavy splash in the mud. Silence fell. The remaining few of Roar's men, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons, their fight broken. The battle was over. As the first faint sliver of dawn pierced the heavy clouds, painting the ravaged sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, the ranch fell quiet. Only the relentless drumming of the rain remained. The courtyard was littered with the fallen, and standing amidst the carnage, exhausted, their clothes torn and smeared with mud, were Asher and Seraphine. He stumbled towards her, his body a map of aches and bruises. The silence between them was no longer one of tension, but of raw, unvarnished honesty. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and vulnerable. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, the small revolver still clutched in her hand. "Now you know what was under the dress," she whispered, her voice stripped of all irony. It was a final confession, the baring of her soul. She trembled against him, not from cold, but from the release of a burden carried for a lifetime. Asher didn't speak. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. He lowered his head, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of rain, gunpowder, and a profound, hard-won understanding. In that moment he no longer saw the scar on her side as a mark of violence. He saw it as a testament to her unbreakable spirit, a symbol of strength, a beacon of resilience. In the vast, rain-swept expanse of the Vaughn Ranch, amidst the wreckage of their war, a new story began. A story forged in lies and truth, in blood and rain, bound by a shared past and illuminated by the promise that together they would never have to face the shadows alone. The legacy of their father's sins had been washed clean, leaving behind not a map to a mythical treasure, but something far more valuable: a future. This story of the untamed West is a powerful reminder that the deepest scars often hide the strongest wills, and that true justice sometimes requires walking into the very heart of the storm you've been running from. Seraphine Vaughn didn't seek refuge. She sought reckoning, proving that a dark past doesn't have to define your future. It can fuel it. She turned a place of potential refuge into a carefully laid trap, a testament to the idea that the greatest defense is a well-planned offense. What do you think is more powerful, the need for safety or the thirst for justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If tales of frontier grit and righteous vengeance speak to your soul, you'll find more just like it in our archives. Click here for another story of a lone figure turning the tables on a powerful enemy. And if this story captivated your imagination, don't forget to subscribe to Wanted Stories and hit that like button to help us bring more tales from the shadows of history into the light.